Welcome to this workshop presented by the Florida Atlantic University Libraries. I am Jerrel Horn, and I am a research and instruction librarian with the Florida Atlantic University Library. This workshop is titled 50 Shades of Gray Literature, Looking On Beyond Peer-Reviewed Sources. So the first question that we're going to look at is, where are we going with this? What is gray literature? Why are we going on beyond peer-reviewed literature? Why should gray literature even be considered when you're doing your research? What are some of the problems with gray literature that make it difficult to use? Where and how is gray literature found? And finally, is gray literature better than peer-reviewed literature? There are definitely some problems with peer-reviewed literature, so let's get that out of the way first. One of the main problems with peer-reviewed literature is the lack of inconclusive or negative results. When you're going through peer-reviewed literature, by and large, it's going to give you results that are very conclusive or positive. Peer-reviewed literature really is not going to give you anything where the reviewer didn't find anything or found something that disproved their hypothesis. That just isn't really the case with peer-reviewed literature. There's also a very much a publication bias, since peer-reviewed literature is controlled not just by the researchers, but also by the publishers. There is a bias on what kind of research the publishers will accept. So again, if your research doesn't fit with what the publisher wants, especially with the highly regarded journals, then it can be very difficult to get your research published or to get it published in a journal that a lot of people look at and use. And that leads into the fact that getting papers accepted by the top journals can be very difficult. Not only does it need to fit what the journal wants to publish, but then you have to go to the peer-reviewed process before it can even be published. And all of that, it takes a lot of time and can also cost money. So if you're someone that is doing your research on a small budget, you may not be able to publish with many of these top journals, and that can be a real problem. There are also paywalls to consider. Pretty much all of the top journals charge for accessing their research that they publish. There are open access journals that are very good, and the trend is spreading. But in the end, someone has to pay, whether it's the researcher paying to get their literature published, or the library or institution or industry paying to access, or another researcher paying to access. Somebody has to pay somewhere. Peer-reviewed literature also excludes many valuable types of literature right at the start, such as patents. These are never peer-reviewed. Legal cases, technical reports, white papers, theses, and many other kinds of very valuable resources and valuable research is never peer-reviewed just by its nature. And finally, peer-reviewed literature is generally not the most current source of information on a topic because of the amount of time it takes to get it published. Peer-reviewed literature results from research processes, which are then written up, then peer-reviewed, gone over by the publisher, and finally published. So there tends to be a lag between the research being concluded and finally being published. And there is difficulty finding diverse viewpoints. Again, because peer-reviewed literature is controlled by the publishers, they are very strict on what they will and won't publish. And unfortunately, a lot of the top journals tend to be concentrated in the more technical areas of the world. So that lets out a lot of areas of the world to begin with. Plus, if you are doing research in an area that isn't looked at very well at this time, you can have a great difficulty getting your research published. So now that we've gone through all of the problems with peer-reviewed literature, what do we do then? Well, that's where gray literature comes in. So the first question we're going to ask is, what is gray literature? Well, unfortunately, there isn't really any one definition of it. Um, a lot of researchers define gray literature as fuzzy or fugitive literature, sort of just whatever else is out there. One could even say it's everything published outside of books and journal articles would be possibly gray literature, and that's a valid point. There is you could call it a formal definition. It was agreed to at the International Conference on Gray Literature that was held in 1997. And that definition is that information produced on all levels of government, academia, business, and industry in electronic and print formats, which is not controlled by commercial publishing, that is, where publishing is not the primary activity of the producing body, that information is considered gray literature. So that's about the best definition that we have right now. So maybe a better thing to ask would be, what is not gray literature? Well, gray literature, first off, is not peer-reviewed articles. And I will stop right here and define very quickly what a peer-reviewed article is. A peer-reviewed article is an article that has been submitted to a commercial publisher, accepted by that publisher, and then submitted for peer review, where the article is thoroughly scrutinized and torn apart by peers of the author or authors who are experts in the subject of the article. Once they are satisfied with the article and its contents, it is then returned to the publisher, and once the publisher finally prints the article, then it's considered peer-reviewed. Another work that isn't considered gray literature is published works of art. These are a different kind of resource entirely, which isn't to say they can't be used in research. Obviously, if you're doing research in art or any subject that's adjacent to that, you're going to be looking at works of art. But we are talking about written words, not visible art, pictures, things of that nature. Finally, works of fiction are not considered gray literature. They're their own category of works. Gray literature is nonfiction. That at least, well, at least it's believed by the authors to be nonfiction. Let's put it that way. So the next question then is, why should gray literature be used for research? I mean, it's got this fuzzy definition. We've got a very good quality of research already in peer-reviewed articles that are essentially the gold standard for research that you can trust when you're doing your own research. So why should we look anywhere else? Well, there's very good reasons for doing that. And there are many subjects where it's almost required to look outside of peer-reviewed literature. First off, most of the published information in the world is not peer-reviewed. There is a large volume of information that's published by governments, for example, that is not peer-reviewed. Judicial courts, industry, lots of publishing goes on that doesn't go through the peer-reviewed process. Often, gray literature is more detailed and comprehensive because there's no publisher-enforced limit on the length of this published work. Publishers do enforce various limits for what they will publish, and gray literature doesn't have to abide by that. It's strictly up to the entity that is printing this work. Gray literature includes studies with negative effects or no effects. So in other words, when a researcher does research, they still publish what they found, even if it's negative. They just may not be able to publish it with a commercial publisher. Gray literature includes industry and community perspectives, which can be very valuable. This would include all sorts of white papers, trade publications, policies, dispatches, many, many things that give the perspective of people actually working with the subject of the research. And as I said before, many key documents, like patents, white papers, data sets, and so forth, are not part of peer-reviewed sources. So if you're doing anything that involves these kinds of documents, for example, in engineering, chemistry, or two off the top of my head, that use patents a lot, and those are not peer-reviewed, but they need them for their kind of research. Business reports, if you're doing anything with business, you're going to be looking at the reports put out by the various industry players. Data sets of any type are never peer-reviewed by their nature. Standards for engineering or other disciplines, anything to do with the law or legal issues, none of that is peer-reviewed. And most gray literature is free. So that means that you're not running into paywalls to access most of it. There are exceptions, such as standards are often not free, but most of it is freely available. And so it's also still accessible once the researcher has left the university and gone out into the world to do their work. The business that they work for, they may even run their own business, may not be able to afford access to these various peer-reviewed collections, or they may not be able to get to a university or another institution that does offer access to them, but they still need to do their research and they still need to do their work. So gray literature then gives them a valuable resource that they can use. And gray literature includes newer areas of study where there is little or no peer-reviewed research available. These are all things that people are working on now and putting out now, not a year from now once it's gone through this very thorough process before being published. Okay, what does gray literature contribute then? The kinds of things gray literature contributes to research is thought processes of the person or people that wrote the document, their notes, their opinions, things that are oftentimes left out of peer-reviewed literature because that tries to be, as much as it can be, neutral. Project and software descriptions. Generally, these are not included in peer-reviewed literature unless something like a literature review is done or some other formal piece of research. But there is a lot that is done in the process of working on various kinds of software, various projects, that is never collated to actually be published as a peer-reviewed article. Data, statistics, and survey results, of course, any sort of data, whether raw or processed, is part of gray literature, and that's the only place you can find that. First-hand accounts and observations, witness accounts, diaries, blogs, all of those can be very valuable. There was an attempt to collect President Trump's tweets from the first time he ran for president as a valuable resource for history. Presidential papers, these are all part of firsthand accounts and observations that are part, again, of gray literature. Documentation and standards, documenting how things work, documenting processes, documenting procedures, any of that kind of thing is part of gray literature. Research, of course, outside the mainstream or that did not have positive results. New ideas need to start somewhere, and ideas that really aren't accepted by the main community often don't have any choice but to be published as part of gray literature until they become more mainstream. Pretty much anything to do with legal work. They do also have peer-reviewed articles, but they're very rare. Most of the legal documentation, legal cases, opinions, dockets, all of that kind of stuff is not peer-reviewed, and therefore it's part of gray literature. Clinical trial information is usually not published as peer-reviewed literature either. And recommendations and explanations. Finally, anything ephemeral, such as brochures, pamphlets, presentation slides, and like I said, tweets. These are all valuable pieces of information and are often preserved because they document times in history and what people were thinking and what they were talking about, what they considered important. But nothing is perfect, and just like peer-reviewed literature has its problems, so does gray literature. One of the biggest problems with gray literature is the issue with information literacy. Gray literature, by its nature, has to be evaluated before you can use it. You need to know what you have, and ideally the provenance of what you have, so that you know exactly not just what it's saying, but how trustworthy is it? Is this something that you can use for the research that you're conducting? Authorship, bias, purpose, source of facts in gray literature, all of these must be checked and considered. So in that sense, you have to do a lot of the work yourself that is done for you when it comes to peer-reviewed literature. There's also too many types of gray literature. Peer-reviewed literature is very basic. It's articles published, peer-reviewed in journals, commercial journals. Gray literature goes all over the place. And one of the issues with gray literature is when you're reading say, a peer-reviewed article and the authors mention that they also reviewed gray literature, a lot of times they forget to mention exactly what it was they reviewed, treating it like peer-reviewed. And so they say they went through the gray literature and you're stuck asking, what? Which kind? What did you look at? Details are necessary when you're working with gray literature, especially for quality checking and the key thing, reproducibility. You need to know what was looked at and evaluated. Another issue with gray literature is searching for it. It's not always easy and straightforward. Some things you think might be easy, such as patents, are very difficult and murky to find because patents are generally held by the government, and unfortunately the government doesn't make searching for its literature easy. There's no real large indexes or collections as exist with peer-reviewed literature. It's often easier to find peer-reviewed literature in industry, but then you have the problem that you need to know what you're looking for and who to check with. You need to check your sources one by one. You can't just go to one place and find everything that you want. And many times you need to actually know that the literature possibly exists before you can find it. So with that said, where do you look to find gray literature? Well, I will tell you, it takes time and it takes some ingenuity. One of the things you definitely want to do when you're working with gray literature is do your homework. Figure out your search strategy. Figure out not just your keywords and how you're going to structure your search, but you also need to do some research to begin with to figure out where you're going to look. What places do you need to look? What are good sources for the kind of literature sources that you need? As an example of that, there was a discussion I had at one point talking about if one were to do a project, say, on aerospace, like a component of aerospace, let's say airfoils. One would think, okay, you just look at the peer-reviewed literature, you'll find plenty of sources, and you can do your research and work on your project. Except there is a huge body of literature that is relevant to that. So the person I was talking to, I asked them what else would they look in. They thought a little bit, said maybe patents. I said, yes, that's definitely a good place, but where else might you look? And they couldn't think of anything. And then I reminded them, what about the airline industry, the big players in that industry? Looking at what they've done and what they do. Think about who else works with aerospace, NASA maybe. This is just the start of the kind of thinking you need to do when you're trying to figure out where to find the gray literature that you want to use for your research. Now, there is one source that is good for finding a lot of gray literature, and that is Google Scholar. It's probably one of the top sources for finding it because of how it works. Since it's a search engine and it searches throughout the internet, it gathers all of this literature up. And since most gray literature isn't locked away, Google Scholar can find it. However, there is a big but here. And that is that if the gray literature is locked away as standards, for example, or a lot of data sets, Google Scholar is not going to find it. Also, if the site that hosts that piece of gray literature refuses to allow itself to be scraped, Google Scholar will not find it that way either. So just be aware that although Google Scholar is good, it's not complete and it cannot be. You also want to check companies and institutions that specialize in your topic. They will often have a lot of good resources in the gray literature field, white papers, reports, documentation of all sorts. You just have to look and see what they have available. Government sources, that's where you get patents, legal cases, feasibility studies, all sorts of other kinds of paperwork and publishing that the government does. Check databases that collect the type of gray literature you're searching for. There are databases that do collect specific types, such as conference papers, the various preprint databases like Archive, for instance, theses and dissertations. These databases they collect these things. There's patent search engines that specialize in looking for patents. Those are all things that you can check. And there's one other source I'm going to recommend, and that's GrayNet International's Gray Index for search ideas. Graynet.org, which is the website of GrayNet International, is attempting to catalog the gray literature that's out there and discuss it and really start to get a handle on exactly what is part of this definition of gray literature. And one of the things that they have is an index that lists all of the types of gray literature that they can currently account for, and they update it regularly. So if you check that index, that would give you ideas on other things to search for that you might not have thought of. Now, given all of that, there are some popular sources of gray literature. So these are things that you can check in on first, because these tend to produce most of the gray literature. I'd say these are the top 5. There are other sources, so don't limit yourself to these. And that would be government publications, industry, courts, academia, and don't forget primary sources. That would include newspapers, diaries, blogs, eyewitness accounts. All of that kind of literature is considered gray literature and can be a rich source for your research. So with that said, and I counted and made sure you can count for yourself, 50 types of gray literature. This is not all that's out there. The index from graynet.org, the Gray Literature International, has a lot more, but this is enough to get you started. These items are mostly from industry and companies, white papers, annual reports, meeting minutes, patents, of course, clinical trial data, software, budgets, proxy statements, catalogs, repair manuals even. When we get into more the government and legal area, we get technical reports, brochures, census data, legal opinions, dispatches. The CIA has released a lot of their dispatches. They've been declassified and they're now available to use, so you can get firsthand accounts of a lot of their operations. Laws, regulations, executive orders. I mentioned presidential papers before even. Atlases. Academia, theses, dissertations, conference papers, preprint papers, research posters, course materials, book reviews, pamphlets, flyers, all sorts of things. And in the world of primary sources, now you're looking at diaries and journals, news articles, social media, blogs, interviews, photos. That's where gray literature kind of crosses the line from being written to getting into more of art, but photos are still considered a type of gray literature. Letters, notebooks, even yearbooks, like your high school yearbook. And this is so you can see what some of this gray literature looks like. On the left is an example of a patent. In the middle is an annual report from a big company. On the right is one of those dispatches from the CIA. In particular, this one is talking about shutting down a CIA operation in Europe and some of the problems they ran into. Then we have policies. This is the policy concerning the university library from FAU. We have the Constitution of the United States. Yes, that's gray literature. And a opinion from the Supreme Court on the case of Simmons versus the United States. We have a letter. And if you look at it, the writing's not the greatest, but you can read it. The middle is the dissertation by Dr. Feynman. He was a very prominent physicist and critical in the development of quantum mechanics. The diary of President James K. Polk. All of these are part of gray literature. So now I've gone on and on about gray literature and how important it is and what's contained in it and why we should use it, but don't take my word for it. These are from actual studies done looking at what difference does it make if a research project includes gray literature or if it doesn't. And they found these projects found some very concerning issues. First off, one research project found that gray literature lets you seek more related research, avoid publication bias, comparing different perspectives from between researchers and practitioners. Remember, with research, especially when you're just using peer-reviewed research, you're getting the researcher's perspective. You're really not getting the perspective of someone using or working with, in a practical sense, what the researcher was looking at. Understanding the views of the practitioner's community and exploring uncharted research areas. More blatantly, or more particularly, in this particular study, they found that if gray literature had not been considered for a certain branch of research, no library, no architectural standards or guidelines that are presented on Android apps would exist at all, since those findings were apparently identified only in gray literature and through interviews with the Android engineers. Moreover, in some studies, they found that gray literature was the only type of source that had answers to some of the research questions in those studies. Even though all of these studies did use peer-reviewed sources, but they almost wouldn't have been able to finish their research if they hadn't considered gray literature. A third study found that if you remove gray literature from various meta-analyses, that's where you take these research studies and you look at the data and conclusions that were in those research studies and use them to get a bigger picture of the research. And if you remove gray literature from those analyses, you would result, they found, in 15% larger estimates. In other words, your results would be skewed larger than they really should be. less precise effect size estimates, and more significant results. And this is in quotes because it means that it would make the research look like it did more than it really did. And as a result, excluding unpublished studies, gray literature, could actually compromise the validity and reliability of these meta-analyses and the specificity of systematic reviews because the results would be so skewed and even starting to give false positives. So, which is better, peer-reviewed or gray literature? Which path do you take? Well, take both or neither. What it comes down to is when you're doing your research, the right literature resource is the one that best meets the needs of that research and upholds the best practices of transparency, reproducibility especially, rigor, and ethical work. So you use what will fit your research the best and uphold these best practices, whether it be gray literature, peer-reviewed literature, or mostly both. So what is the current status right now, given all of this that I've talked about? Unfortunately, it's not very good. More researchers are advocating for greater inclusion of gray literature in research, pointing out the wealth of information and data that's left out if gray literature is not reviewed. However, only about 1/3 of published research includes gray literature, so there's still a long way to go. Another study that looked at the Scopus database, which is a very large database of peer-reviewed literature, focusing especially on the sciences, that study found that a much smaller fraction, 0.05% of the published papers in Scopus included gray literature. And they also found that many publishers refuse to accept articles that include gray literature because that resource is not officially peer-reviewed. So there is some very real barriers to making our research better, and it's barriers that all of us as researchers need to push against. How do you go further beyond? Well, these are some questions that you can ask yourself and ask your colleagues, and perhaps even ask those that publish these research papers. Why isn't gray literature used more in literature reviews and published papers? And what can you do about it to get it used more? Remember, that doesn't mean you're throwing out peer-reviewed. What you're doing is going beyond it. What are the issues that researchers have with using gray literature? And for those of us in the library, what can we do to contribute to addressing these issues? And what can you do as researchers to address these issues? So how do we encourage the greater use of gray literature in published research? That is the big question we need to ask. If you're interested in the resources that I used for this workshop, I've listed them here, and you're welcome to go and look at these articles. And I highly encourage you to do it. They have some very interesting information on the use of gray literature and using gray literature along with peer-reviewed literature. This is my information if you'd like to get in touch to discuss gray literature or anything else that you need to discuss with regards to your research or your projects. So I'd welcome hearing from you. As you can see, I have a specialty in physics and mathematics, and I work mostly with the STEM subjects, but I'm available to help with whatever questions you have with regards to your work. And finally, I do ask that you leave me your thoughts. We create these workshops from time to time, and we want to make them the best that they can be. And the only way we can do that is with your feedback and letting us know what was done well and what you'd like to see improved. So you can use the QR code or the link. It's a very short survey, only about 3 questions, but I do please ask that you take it and just let us know what you think. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed this workshop.